Something almost magical happens when connections start happening and you develop thoughts that seemingly came out of nowhere but are exactly what you needed. Welcome to the Love Your Brain podcast, the podcast designed for everyday people who are ready to hop off the negative thought hamster wheel and enjoy a less hostile environment in their own brains. Our brains are where we live our entire lives, and I'm on a mission to help people see that they have everything they need to make it a happier place to be. So join us for this episode of the Love Your Brain podcast. Let's get started. This being our first episode of the podcast, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about the premise of the podcast and why I felt like it was something I wanted to create. And then we'll move into a bit about the title of this podcast, why the content doesn't matter, a little later. To give you some background about me, I'm a social worker, a life coach, and I've been in the helping profession for over 20 years. But more important than that, I'm someone like probably many of you. I've lived through trauma over my lifetime that has, in fact, changed how my brain operates, in addition to just being someone who was born with likely some genetic predispositions to things like depression, anxiety, addiction, and the list goes on. If I was to estimate, I would say I probably have put hundreds of hours, maybe more, into therapy and other programs over the years in an attempt to make my own brain a happier place to be. In some ways, I've done this in an attempt to not only make my brain a happier place to be, but also to just help me be a better professional in helping walk others through their own journey of addressing their mental health and almost using myself as a bit of a experiment to try out different therapeutic modalities and just learning more about what's out there and how I can also guide people to get help as well. And although I've found that that journey has been incredibly helpful, learning tools and different ways to change how my brain operates and really change the course of my journey, I'm finally to a place now where I appreciate my brain so much more than I have in the past. And I've really been improving my relationship with myself as I've learned to trust myself more. And that is truly the content I hope to share with you on this podcast more than anything is that you are so valuable as you are today, even if you're in the midst of struggle. You have so many of the answers you're seeking inside of yourself, and sometimes it just takes reinvesting in that good old brain of yours in order to find the path that you need in order to get out of the darkness. You need more of you, not necessarily someone outside of yourself to help you find the answer. And so I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you've joined me for this first podcast episode. And I'm so excited to be on your journey with you. So, why am I focusing specifically on the brain? First off, the brain is where so much begins, and it's where we live our lives. Our brains are where we create our thoughts, that create our emotions, and in turn create our reality. Our brains are also the vehicle for how we perceive the world around us, our beliefs, our thoughts about others, and our thoughts about ourselves. They're incredibly important for how we experience our lives. But I feel like over the years, the concept of our brains has really gotten a bad rap. In the last few decades, the focus on brain dysfunction and diagnosing things like depression, anxiety, ADHD, autism, and really going deep into how those show up in different populations, that information has come to the surface and it's been incredibly helpful in a lot of ways. But I also think there is a dark side of that that has almost made a lot of people feel angry, hurt, or even frustrated by the ways that their brains operate because they're looking at this way of operating as a problem, like their brains are almost betraying them. And I can tell you, as someone who has worked in a field alongside people with perceived limitations or disabilities, I believe we are looking at a lot of this supposed brain dysfunction completely backwards. There are so many strengths that come from having a brain that works in a non traditional way that are completely overlooked. But we'll be focusing more on that topic another day. Overall, though, these negative perspectives towards our brains, I don't think are serving us well. And it may go without saying, but I think also people have gotten so focused on changing the outer life as opposed to the inner life. People are so focused on changing their circumstances, their job, their home, their relationships, all of these things that in the end don't necessarily change how our brain is operating. And it's not getting people the lived experience that they actually want. And although I am all about people going after their goals and manifesting huge things, some people end up with those things and still have the same negative thoughts ruminating in their brains that make life really unpleasant for them. And that is not what we are going for here. They simply neglect to address how their brains are actually impacting their experience and how they're feeling fulfilled in their daily lives. And we know this happens so clearly by watching the lives of famous people, right? They get the success, the money, the appearance of love from others, and yet so many struggle terribly with their mental health, addiction. It's heart-wrenching to watch. And we're over here looking from the outside thinking, but you have so much to be grateful for, but they aren't addressing what is actually happening in their brain. So, in fact, none of those things on the outside are doing what they want. They're not impacting how they think and feel, and probably not getting the result they had hoped for. And in the age of information, I think our brains have really been neglected in a lot of ways. And I say this because we take in so much information, we take in so many things, whether it's thoughts from other people or media. It all comes into our brains, and often it starts to do a bit of rotting. We just keep piling in all types of information, some good, but also plenty negative, or even sometimes fear inducing information. And our brains just hoard this information and it just becomes like a cesspool of negativity. And sometimes those cesspools get filled with negative thoughts about the world around us, but sometimes even with thoughts that are negative about ourselves. Our brains are just getting clogged up with too much outside stuff that they don't even know what they know anymore. When they get bogged down with all that gunk, they can't even have the flexibility and freedom to do what they were created to do. Think about it. If you've ever seen a room where someone had been hoarding items and it just gets piled on and piled on, over time, you can't even see much of the room anymore or even distinguish what's supposed to be there, what's not supposed to be there, what belongs in the room, what doesn't belong in the room. You can't even really tell what the room was supposed to be used for anymore. It's just so filled. And that's how many of our brains have become, too stuffed with stuff that doesn't belong there, and we can't even figure out how we want to use our brains. What were our brains intended to do? We've lost sight of the fact that our brains were meant to grow, they were meant to change, birth new ideas, new perspectives. They're incredible things if we can see their value and put the time in and effort in and working to make those environments in our brains a better place. And I'll be honest, as someone who has sought out so many experts in the mental health world to help me with my own brain, I've truly found that although experts can be incredibly helpful, they're not the end all be all. If you've ever been in a bad place mentally and trying to find a therapist or a program to help, think about all the energy that happens in that process. Sometimes we can get into this fixed mindset that the solution is outside of us, that once we find the right expert, they will help us fix this mess that's inside of our brains. And outsourcing that power can, in fact, feel almost scary and disempowering in a lot of ways. We think that if we can't find the right person, what will happen to us then? Or will we just put our lives on hold until we find the right answer? And often we're left waiting for long periods of time to get the answers or solutions that we actually thought we wanted. And although I'm a huge advocate for seeking out services to help you on your journey, I mean, that's been a huge part of my profession, I want to caution you that discounting your own knowledge and wisdom and thinking everything you need is outside of you is not necessarily going to get you where you want to be. The single most valuable resource any of us have is ourselves. And I don't say that to just say, go it alone. I say that to remind you that you're also an expert. You have so many tools and resources in your own brain, it's wild. Our brains process things in a way that even scientists can't even fully explain. It's incredible. So, with this podcast, I hope you listen. I hope you feel empowered to learn about your brain, appreciate how it works, even if it's quote unquote not normal. Maybe you'll find ways to help your brain operate in a way that makes you feel more fulfilled and maybe just appreciate it a little more. Which all leads me to the title of today's episode: Why Content Doesn't Matter. Now, I've been stewing on launching this podcast for way too long, I'll be honest with you. I've had a few people ask me, when are you coming out with another podcast? And for months, I've just kept saying, maybe soon. And the truth of the matter is, I kept getting stuck on the content and the direction I wanted to take this podcast because I was feeling like if I started off wrong, then maybe I'd have to pivot. like I've had to do with other projects. And honestly, I'm so tired of pivoting. But what that meant for me was that I was getting stuck in the weeds of the details and making no forward movement. In my brain, I would only press publish once I had everything perfect, and we know what happens when we get that mentality. Well, it just doesn't happen because perfect is never going to happen. And I wasn't willing to let that be an option. So I decided I would be less frustrated if I launched and had to pivot later than to have everything stewing in my brain for the next century and going nowhere. So here we are. But the truth is, I've also had a pretty big aha moment through this whole process of putting this podcast together. And I think it's important to share, especially as we launch it. I was reflecting on podcasts that I personally love and other things that have really made a difference in my own life, like books I've read, speakers I've listened to, and I've really tried to hone in on the things that helped me to take the steps I needed to transform my life, transform how my brain operates. And what I realized was that the way it usually started for me was by just consuming content from someone, and from there, my own brain would take me down a path of discovery that would help me to take action in my life or see things from a different perspective. And what I realized about that content is that very rarely were the details of that content what made the difference for me. In fact, a lot of the time, I can't even remember much about it. But what would happen is that I would connect with a creator, connect with an author or a speaker or a teacher, whoever it may be, and I would reflect on the information they were sharing. And then my own brain did the magical work of creating my own inspired thoughts. So, in fact, the what part of the content isn't really what's made the difference. It's simply the vehicle. The content was the vehicle that allowed my brain to process the thoughts to get me those light bulb moments that moved me forward. And the funny part of that is, I've had so many moments in my life where I'm telling someone who maybe read the same book or listen to the same speech or podcast, and I tell them about what I took away from it, what information I gleaned from it. And they look at me like I seriously have 9 heads because it's nothing like what they took away from it. It's absolutely wild. And sometimes I'll even go back and re-listen or reread and try to take that information in from a really like neutral, fact-absorbing way. And I even think I'm a little crazy for what I in fact originally gleaned from the information. For example, maybe you're listening to a speaker and you and your friend compare notes, and afterwards you're just talking through like everything you jotted down, and you realize how different the highlights are that both of you put down because your brains process information differently. And obviously, a lot of that is because we all have our own perspectives, our different belief systems, different cultural backgrounds. All different things go into play there. But also, I truly believe that when our brains take in information, something almost magical happens. When connections start happening and you develop thoughts that seemingly came out of nowhere, but are exactly what you needed. And that's what I realized I wanted for this podcast. Not necessarily that it provides any content that in itself is life changing, but that while you're listening, your own brain has a space to process and develop thoughts that are what you need on your journey right now. So, needless to say, I realized I never needed to worry quite as much as I did about the content. It was stressing me out, but the content really doesn't matter as much as I thought it did. It's much more about creating a space where you feel empowered to develop your own thoughts, learn to trust yourself more, and process things in a way where you find exactly what you need. So, in each episode on this podcast, I'll be sharing a little bit of my own journey, some things I've learned along my own path and along my path of helping others. And hopefully, it will simply be the vehicle you need to inspire something new in you. I'm so excited you're here and everything that's in store for both of us. So join me here each week on the Love Your Brain podcast. I hope you found something helpful here today on the Love Your Brain podcast. Maybe a laugh or a feeling of validation, or maybe just a few moments to have company while you do your laundry. Whatever you take from it, I hope you enjoyed your time and leave feeling empowered to be more you every day. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss out on the next episode, and leave a review. I'd love to hear what you think. Have a great one.